Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about aspects of Yedo 4. As with a lot of the previous Yedo forms, they're pretty short, right? So for example, this one has a few interesting aspects to it, right? So the first is actually going to be simply drawing with the left foot forward. Now, I know that might sound kind of like a who cares kind of thing, but try it, right? So as you started going through this form, that was probably one of the harder parts because we're so used to when we step, right, this whole area is kind of open for us to help draw. Versus now, that space is taken up by your leg. You have to kind of like go across your body. It's not particularly comfortable, and you're going into a quick draw. So notice again what feels different with this one. So for example, like what makes this draw different from like Sangsu 1, for instance. Right, so Sangsu 1, you have a big, powerful cut that way, and yet at 4, again, we're stepping weirdly as we're coming forward, and we're here, and then we're going to come into our Paosongse, right? So why, right? So why is that a little bit different, right? So one thing you might notice is there's significantly less power, which obviously makes sense, right? Because when we are drawing in our Sangsu 1, or Sangsu 2, for most of those, the idea is, again, all this open space. On top of that, I can engage my hip, right? To kind of blow through that cut, and then have a comfortable distance to get back in defense. Notice also the range is pretty good versus, right, what we're doing with Yedo 4. So Yedo 4, again, we're stepping with our left foot. The range is a little bit shorter just because we can't draw out as much that way. Here, and we're immediately going into a close guard. Notice we're not going into a defense this way, we're going into a Paosongse guard here, which is usually a lot more of a kind of defensive, kind of protecting yourself a little more back here, right, as opposed to something a little more offensive, a little more affronting this way. So one way you can interpret this is that the draw is kind of, again, a worst case scenario, right? So we've been, this is the, what is this, the 17th form, right? And we've always been kind of working with kind of best case scenarios, right? So form 1 is I have a huge, big, powerful draw. Same thing form 2. Form 3, I have enough space and time to step with it. But it's, again, powerful, hitting off to the side this way. So in most of the forms, we start off pretty strong. Form 4, not so much. Now the thing is also, if you do use a shorter sword, which is what Yedo allegedly does, it's a little bit easier, right? But the same issues kind of arise. We still have the same reach. If we are using a shorter weapon, we want to have as much reach as possible, although the draw will be easier. So just a couple things to keep in mind, right? So go through this a couple more times. One thing that's going to help you draw more effectively is actually using your scabbard better, right? So if we're here, we really pull that scabbard back as we step into that cross, and then back into our yoke, so to say, Paosongse. Right? I feel like that didn't sound right, but Paosongse, right? And yoke, so to say. Makes sense? Now, if you learn this form, you know that there's a lot of repetition, right? There's a single combination we do 4 times in a row, which seems a little bit extreme, right? But there is a new-ish move in that combination, and that's going to be our two-handed vertical cut. Now, if you've done your cutting focus, which you should have by the time you've come here, right? You know you're going to be coming up with that, again, vertical strike. Now, what I'd like to also do here, right, is also discuss like what's the purpose of the vertical strike. I may have potentially touched upon this in a different video, but so if we're here, so again, the most obvious thing a lot of people think about when you do that nice vertical strike is going to the opposite of the center, right? Hitting like the groin and then going up this way. Okay, cool. That'd be very, your opponent will be very disgruntled if you do that. But it's not necessarily going to be an instant kill or anything like that, because there are, again, if you hit the tailbone, again, depending on how deep you are, you're not hitting the main bits, right? So you're not talking about like the heart, you're not talking about like the kidneys are also off to one side. You might again sever like the stomach or something like that, intestine, blah, blah, blah. but those are all like really slow, and that person will still be able to come after you, right? Which they probably would, right? So yes, one targeted area can absolutely be just right up the middle. But a couple other places, and this is usually going to be true, especially in Bangkok, where we start doing the several strike vertical strikes that way, is you're actually going to be hitting the inside of the leg as well, right? So the inside, I'm going to step back so you can ideally see, hitting this here. Because we have a lot of good arteries that we can kind of aim for, and if we do that, again, in terms of the sword fight, that'd be good. Also, it is an area that's not as likely to be protected. So if you think about the armor that was worn at the time, it's not like rolling armor this way. So it's like there are folds in the armor. Versus if you kind of go up against the fold, it's not as effective. That's going to help you. But regardless, right? So we have a vertical strike in our in this new form, right? So we strike, so we block up. We really get that nice big preparation as we step with it, right? As we step with it up the middle, bam, right? And we're going to do that a good number of times after that. So again, so think about what's going on with that combination, right? So in theory, you're blocking a sword out of the way, and you just have a nice big powerful cut. Or another way you can think of it is you're simply just trying to get your distance with these, like a set of vertical cuts. You're just generating a lot of sword space, right? So this is more just kind of like getting your space here, with that vertical cut being like in case they are too close, you can probably hit something with that. Right, because if you probably see someone coming at you with a vertical cut, you usually don't bother with it. You don't try to block it per se. Because again, if the target area is, again, the knee or the inside of the leg this way, you have to get pretty low in order to block it. Most likely you just want to back away from it. So a vertical cut's actually really good for getting someone to back off. So similarly to Sangsu 7, right, where we have this, it's again targeting one person, but it's really good at that one thing. So keep that in mind. So again, think about what's going on in terms of the combat, and also like what you're hitting with this vertical strike. Now the third one I would like to mention is, again, playing into my bias, right? So again, I assume that Yedo is really intended for one-handed. This particular form is really good about that, right? So again, even the introduction, this might be even a little bit longer than you probably would be used to for a short sword, but here, again, you can be in a nice offensive position here. This is ready to really strike. So with a one-handed sword, this is actually pretty good in terms of striking. You can actually move pretty effectively from many different points. For example, like Pao Sung Se means 8, right? So Pao means 8. Potentially you can strike from 8 directions. But you can also strike from many different places, especially with a one-handed sword here, right? Two-handed is a little bit weirder, right? You have to kind of engage yourself in a different way in order to kind of, again, strike effectively. But again, using Pao Sung Se in terms of a guard for one-handed is really good, but think about that combination near the end. That's really good kind of support for the idea that this is intended for one-handed. Because just imagine just the amount of power, right? So you're here, rolling up, bang, bang, this way, right? You can generate a lot of like one-handed power as you're coming up with these strikes, as that nice parry up strike, right? You can get a lot of good power with that, and even nearing the end, right? Where we do our Pao Sung Se, right? So Pao Sung Se and then cutting, right? All good stuff for a nice one-hand weapon. So what I'd recommend is just play with this form. This form in particular is really nice for one-handed, maybe with the exception of the Pao Sung Se for one thing, maybe helping it this way. But try going through this form one-handed, right? So using a one-handed sword or using your mukam one-handed, just using your other hand just as counterbalance. Also just kind of, again, if you're working on pressure, equal and opposite pressure coming from that open hand. As usual, can we retcon these ideas? To a certain degree, right? So a lot of the times, again, the forms kind of assume worst case scenarios, right? So even some of our guards, like again, I talked about this in the past, but even a guard like Pao Sung Se, which is much higher up, is assuming, again, the worst case scenario, we're using a really long, really heavy weapon, and you still need to navigate and move pretty happily, right? Same thing with, again, like even by the amount that you spin in jump cuts, you usually do like a full spin this way which usually you don't have to do entirely if you are actually applying this against a partner, because they're usually not going to be directly behind you as you spin around them. So you do this idea pretty often, right? So you're usually planning for the worst case scenario, and this is not a counterexample, right? So using, again, that weird left foot draw, again, is a worst case scenario. Then we don't do that again for a while. The next one I can think of off the top of my head is Bangkok 5, right, where we do the same exact thing, where you're drawing a nice big cut and coming in house Chochonsei, right? But again, we do use forms in worst case scenarios. This one in particular is new for us, as is the two-handed vertical cut, right? So that is also a new technique, form related, right? Although that said, using it in a certain way, so again, using this as a means to back someone off, once again, it's not new, right? So you can think about pretty much whenever using an uppercut, right? So for example, even in form 2, right? So we're here, coming up, diagonal, most likely not actually cutting anyone with this uppercut because it's not that strong, but it's definitely going to be pretty good at backing someone off, right? Now again, you can parry it. It's even harder to parry a vertical cut. But again, the idea of just using, again, a cut as a way to ward someone off isn't new, and it's something that's actually going to be pretty useful as you continue to think about it. And obviously the last one is using one-handed stuff for, again, Yedo. So again, this isn't going to be necessarily new per se, but try it. So try going through, again, your Yedo forms with one hand, kind of like see the difference that you can feel in the texture of the form. So as always, so keep training, stay humble, and make sure you stay safe. Haidong!